Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a real pleasure to welcome back to the program Ilan Pappe, professor of history at the University of Exeter in the UK and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies, author of one of many books, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, which came out this past June, I believe. Professor, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be with you again.
We last spoke with you. I don't know if you recall. I imagine this has been a rather busy year for you this year in particular. But we last spoke with you almost a year ago on October 23rd of 2023. And by then, it was already clear this was going to be a horrific assault on Gaza. I'm curious. I just want to start with this, and then I want to go into some of the things that I learned through your book, and then bring us back to more present day and a piece you just wrote in the Palestine Chronicle. But to the extent that you can recall, what you were imagining or what you were anticipating, more or less this time, late October of 2023, how has your perspective or your sense of what's happening changed, if it has at all? Has there been anything that has you found particularly shocking over the course of the past year, in terms of the actions the various entities have played?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've asked it myself several times in this last year. I think in one sentence I can say that many think that I could detect as potentially happening or as processes that have potential to mature and change dramatically the reality in Israel and Palestine are not potential anymore. They're just happening. In a way, it's like imagining a very slow process, and suddenly you realize it's not slow at all. It's like moving fast beyond your comprehension. And I will give two examples. I mean, I was aware before the 7th of October of how right-wing the Israeli society became. And I was aware of the messianic nature of the Israeli government that was elected in November 2022. And I was aware of their plans and their ideas. But somehow I believe that this is still a process in the making, that we have to wait and see whether our worst case scenarios are unfolding or not. And I think what happened the last year, that the worst case scenarios in every respect that is related to the ideology of the government and the racist attitudes of the Israeli Jewish society, the majority of the members of that society, the worst case scenario has been unfolding, has happened, occurring much quicker than any of us, I think, ever thought. So that's one process where I was really did not expect it to go that fast and that dramatically to change the reality and just erasing any hope for an alternative thinking or any hope for an alternative political system. The second process is the process of disintegration of Israel, the collapse of the Zionist project. I before the 7th of October, I thought that in a generation's time, and this is 25 years, and this is a more kind of soft prediction, that you already see processes, but you are very careful in stating that you know exactly how they will mature, because you're not sure how events will evolve 10 years or 15 years from now. So my whole attitude, not only mine, I know many colleagues of mine, was very careful in kind of giving some more precise prediction of where Israel is going, where the Zionist project is going. I think the last year, and I think I described it in certain places, was like a huge earthquake that exposed extensive cracks in the building that is called the State of Israel. So if you want, if I may use this metaphor, I knew there were cracks in the building. I didn't know how extensive they are and how precarious this building is. And therefore, I don't think this is anymore a story of the far future, kind of a distant future from now, that I, especially as an academic, not just an activist, have to be very careful in choosing my words of what can happen. I'm just seeing it in front of my eyes. I see these cracks in the building, and I'm talking about metaphorically, but what I mean here is a failed state. We have failed states around us in Israel. We have one in Syria. We have not far away from us in Libya. So there are real models I can look at, contemporary models of disintegrating states, and I recognize the same symptoms now in Israel. It's like Israel is now fully integrated into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the Arab world in that respect.
That's fascinating. I think we definitely want to circle back around to that notion of where Israel is, in terms of its state as a state, and where it's going to its future. Let me just ask you, in terms of the first observation, I guess the despair, maybe, perhaps, I don't know, I don't want to put words into your mouth, in terms of like the realization or the watching the progression of the right-wing ideology and just how much it had permeated. I mean, people forget that in 2023, the first half of 2023 was a series of major protests that were a function about Netanyahu's attempt to change the relationship between the judiciary and civil society. One of the questions in people that we had interviewed at the time was, would there be a connection between what was being brought home essentially from the West Bank and perhaps Gaza, this authoritarianism that was attempted to sort of like be integrated into a Jewish Israeli society? Would the protesters make this connection of like, this is the situation that has existed for the Palestinians? And there was, the assessment was, it doesn't seem like it's happening. This goes the complete, other direction. What was this a natural progression from Zionism, or do you believe that this was a potential? And if it was just a potential from the essence of Zionism, what things went wrong from the perspective of those of us who see Israel as becoming increasingly authoritarian and fascist in some respects?
Well, to be honest, the whole project that began to be implemented in the late 19th century of imposing a European Jewish state on the Arab world and trying to build it in the midst of the Arab world, imposing it on millions of people against their will, people who already began their own process of modernization and adopting a national identity, and like all the other people in their surrounding, dreaming of their own independence and freedom after 400 years of Ottoman rule. This project could not have succeeded. And the only reason it lasted so long, as we know, is not merely because of this, the capacity of the settlers to build a high-tech state and build also a very formidable military capacity, but mainly because external power sustained it for their own interests. And it was definitely a logical, I'm afraid, it's a logical development of any settler colonial project like the Zionist project. The DNA of such a project is to continue and try and get as much of the new land that which they arrived in the late 19th century and have in it as few of the indigenous native people who lived there. Now, in certain historical moments, as happened in the United States 200 years before, 100 years before, you could genocide the native people and remove them in a very significant way. And although they're still there and they're still struggling, you can build a settler state that more or less survives and exists. But if you do it the way the Zionists did in that particular historical timing, the late 19th century, when decolonization already starts and people already thinking about decolonization, and when the Palestinians are at a very high level already of national identity, or adopting a collective national identity and ready to begin an anti-colonialist struggle, there was no hope that this would ever that the Zionist project would ever succeed unless, and this will come to the second part of your question, unless there would be a moment, or there would be moments in the history of the Zionist project and later of the State of Israel, in which its leaders, its political leaders, or its political and cultural and economic elite would understand something that at least some of the white in South Africa understood in the very last minutes before the apartheid regime collapsed over there, namely that you have totally to differently reimagine the relationship between yourself, the community of settlers, and even the settler state that you have built, and the indigenous native people, the Palestinians, but not only the native Palestinians, but the Arab world into which you settled, in which part of which you have colonized. Very much like the whites in South Africa realizing not only that apartheid is not working, but after 400 years they were reminded that they're actually in Africa. And Israel still thinks that it's in Europe. It still does not recognize its geographical, cultural location, its historical location. So this was from the very beginning, because this is the DNA of any settler movement from Europe that covets someone else's homeland. So in many ways, this is an inevitable consequence. But as an historian, I could see the moments where things could have changed, or at least they will create some conditions for change. But this particular settler colonial project did not have enough intellectual, political, cultural forces in it to dare and offer an alternative. And there was no one from its allies, and this project had, strong allies from the very beginning to our time. It's the alliance that decided that the settler colonial Jewish state in Palestine is an asset, is something that should be supported. This alliance is incredible. I don't remember in history such alliance. I mean, it includes the mega powers of the world, the mega multinational corporation, the Christian world, the religious Christian hierarchy, not to mention, of course, Jewish communities around the world, military industries, security industries, high-tech industries. I mean, it's a powerful alliance. It doesn't create an incentive, actually, to try an alternative. I'm also blaming that part. Of course, the responsibility lies on the Israelis themselves to understand that they are now torturing the Palestinians and abusing their rights and oppressing them for more than 76 years, if not longer. But in order to make them at least realize that there is a need for an alternative, even if they themselves don't understand that there's a need for an alternative, you need international pressure. And as you probably noticed, even the regional pressure that was, at least at the time of Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and some solidarity with the Palestinian Liberation Movement in places like Kuwait, Syria, in Lebanon, even that has changed. And there are important regional powers are part of that alliance.
That dynamic of enabling that you're talking about in terms of like these international players, and Israel never getting to sort of like a rock and a hard place where they might, as a society, might have chosen these potential alternative paths at various points in its history, is in some respects, what you've written about in lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic. And let's start with, if we could, I have just a couple of questions about this, just so that people get a sense of the context. I had always known that Balfour, of the Balfour Declaration of 1918, was an anti-Semite, and that the inspiration for, or at least in part, for a colony, a Zionist colony or Jewish colony in Palestine was, that way they don't come here. Speaking of like Russian emigres and whatnot. I mean, it's like, we had something similar with abolitionists. There was a certain crew of abolitionists in our history who were like, we shouldn't have slaves, but we should also ship them back to Africa. What I did not realize, though, which is very similar to the dynamic that we have in this country today, was the role of Christian evangelicals, that Balfour was a Christian evangelical. Can you extrapolate on that? Because Kufi, we will talk about AIPAC in a moment, but Kufi in this country is a big evangelical Christian organization that is specifically a Christian Zionist organization that may have even more resources than, in fact, AIPAC does in many respects. If you could just sort of like outline that history and the historic parallels.
Yes, definitely. It starts with the fact that is usually overlooked, that actually Zionism began as an evangelical Christian idea before it became a Jewish idea. Of course, not every evangelical stream subscribed to it, but a very important stream within evangelical Christianity, even before one Jewish intellectual or activist thought about Zionism, was already in existence in the late 18th century and the very beginning of the 19th century. This was the idea that what they called the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, or the return of the Jews of Palestine, is part of a divine scheme that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the beginning of the end of time. The difference between them and other Christians who also believed in such an apocalyptic, scenario was that they thought that actually you could accelerate the process by encouraging the Jews to go to Palestine, that would kind of activate that kind of process that eventually would bring back Jesus Christ. And of course, one of the reasons that they supported it was also anti-Semitism. So as I say in the book, I mean, these were people who wanted to get rid of the Jews in their vicinity and instead get back the only Jew they wanted, Jesus Christ, kind of a double bill for evangelical Christians. And they held very important positions in government, in industry, in culture, and were very effective as preachers, as people with connection to aristocracy in Britain or the political elite in the United States. I think they became particularly powerful when they began to add to the religious explanation or motivation for the need to settle the Jews in Palestine, also secular explanations. When, especially they began in Britain, when these evangelical Christians realized that they might have allies who are not necessarily that religious, but would have liked to expand the British Empire over areas that at that time were still part of the Ottoman Empire. They became even more powerful. So some of the people who joined these evangelical Christians in pushing the idea of settling the Jews in Palestine were imperialists rather than evangelical Christians, to put it that way. But that created that kind of alliance. And the final leg, if you want, in this triangle that was the basis for Zionism even before Zionism became a known feature among the Jews of Eastern and Central Europe, were the Anglo-Jewish aristocrats. Because the Anglo-Jewish aristocrats were aware that for economic reasons and cultural reasons and discriminatory policies, especially the Jews in Russia, were beginning to come in large numbers to Britain. And some of them came even with some revolutionary ideas a bit later on. And they also wanted to stop the flow of Jews into Britain. Later, their counterparts, who were not aristocrats, but were already established American Jews, didn't want that flow to come to the United States. And they added their voice, or they strengthened that alliance that was basically anti-Semitic, even when we're talking about these Anglo-aristocratic Jews. So diverting them to Palestine, first and foremost, for the non-evangelical Christians, was a way of stopping poor Jews coming into the West. For the evangelical Christians, it was, of course, an indication that the end of time is near, and this is the first station in a long road up to salvation and redemption.
I'm reminded of Manifest Destiny when you speak about colonization with these religious justifications behind it and how those things get tangled together. And we spoke, actually, I did yesterday, to Adam Hania, who wrote Crude Capitalism. I believe he's also at University of Exeter as well. Right. And he speaks about just basically the geopolitical importance of the Middle East, and also of how oil played into the explosive growth of capitalism, particularly in the 20th century. You know, I'm curious about your analysis of the Suez Canal and its placement right next to Israel, and how that was essential to also the capitalists' desire to settle Palestine and make it a Western colony.
In my analysis, the fact that there was the Suez Canal, and it became a British interest to control it because of the need to have easy connection to Britain's colonies in Southeast Asia, that particular argument that you need to have Palestine as a British colony was developed on the eve of the First World War. I don't think before that. Actually, until the 1914, until the outbreak of the First World War, from a strategic point of view, Britain was not interested in Palestine. It was interested in Iraq because it also had the ways. I mean, you could go through Iraq, through the rivers, to the ocean, in the Suez Canal in Egypt, and roughly when they began to understand there is oil first in Persia, that is Iran, and the Arabian Peninsula, they became also interested in those areas. I think that once it was clear that the Ottomans, or rather the Turkish army, when the fighting began in the Middle East, would use Palestine to attack the British in Egypt, then I think British strategists decided that in order to protect the canal, you need also to occupy Palestine. And that was, as I write in the book, this happened in 1915. It was a very crucial moment because the British Empire had two options. One suggested by Lawrence of Arabia and his friends. He said, yes, you're right. If you want to protect the Suez Canal, you need to control Palestine. So Palestine has to be, Lawrence of Arabia agreed, it has to be part of the British influence or empire. But he said, we need an Arab ruler in Palestine. And he suggested his good friends, the Hashemites, who were his main allies. Those of you who are familiar with the Lawrence of Arabia story that was also made into a Hollywood film, he was connected with the Hashemite family, the family that protected the Mecca and Medina, the holiest places for Islam, and they participated with him with the British in the war efforts against the Turks in the Middle East. And Lawrence of Arabia and his associates believed that they should have been rewarded for that part by allowing them to create kingdoms all over the Eastern Mediterranean that used to be Ottoman and now becomes part of European colonial empires. The British hoped that most of it would be under British rule. And Palestine was included in that promise. So that was one option. And I write in the book that the lobby understood precisely that this was a rare moment in history. If they are not going to convince the British in 1915 that it's not enough to have a British Palestine in order to protect the canal, you need a Jewish British Palestine or a Jewish Palestine to protect that particular British interest and other interests, British interest in the area. And they succeeded in doing it. The first success of the Zionist lobby, even before the Balfour Declaration, is to make sure that the British plans to occupy Palestine and take it away from the Ottomans after 400 years of Ottoman rule will be connected to the idea of creating a Jewish state. And for that, they needed all these alliance I talked with Sam about. They needed all these people, the Anglo-Jewish aristocrats, the evangelical Christians, the anti-Semitic British and American, and everyone in the British sphere who, for one reason or another, liked the idea of a Jewish state and preferred it to the idea of an Arab state in Palestine. So I think the Suez Canal was a British interest, but that doesn't explain support for Zionism. They could have had a pro-British Arab Palestine protecting the Suez Canal. The greatest success of the Zionist lobby is to say, to insert something which is not a strategic argument at all, or an economic argument. It's a religious argument. It's a religious argument in a secular empire. And they succeed in doing it, I think, mainly because it was also answering anti-Semitic phobia and the fact that probably Europe was not that secular yet. Maybe it isn't even, as we speak, that secular as we think.
Was part of that also a function? Because I'm fascinated by the aristocratic, the Jewish aristocratic elite in Britain, and it's I don't think it's hard for to imagine that established elite there don't want Russian Jewish peasants to be coming in and either from their perspective, like I don't know, tainting the waters, as it were, in their experience in Britain. And I wonder too, though, whether, for some it was religious, but I wonder for others if these aristocratic Jewish elite don't go to the British and say, the value added by having a Jewish Palestine as opposed to a Hashemite one is that, we can talk to each other in a way that we're used to, that type of thing. And if we have a Jewish Palestine, I have a network around the entire world where we have traded because of the way that Jews have been singled out in various societies over time, and this and that. We have a network. We can integrate this into our network. There's a value add there that is beyond the Hashemite kingdom, because we're a little bit more eye to eye as much as we are alien amongst the British. At what juncture, when we talk about the lobby, and I think it's going to become, it becomes more explicit, obviously, as we go through time, what constitutes it. But at what point does the lobby develop we have this, long-standing idea of Zionism from evangelical Christians because they want to bring about the second coming. Herzl comes on the scene in the mid to late 1800s with an idea, not for the same reason, obviously, but at what point does it become a lobby for a Jewish state in Palestine, as opposed to a lobby or an intellectual movement about the idea of a Jewish state?
I think the moment that the Zionist leadership gave up the idea of looking for alternative destination. As you know, the last destination that even Theodor Herzl, the founder and leader of the movement, was willing to consider was Uganda in Africa as alternative to Palestine. The moment his ideas are defeated by his colleagues in the leadership of the Zionist movement, which is around 1903, in that moment, the Zionist lobby is totally focused on creating a Jewish state in Palestine and doesn't consider any other alternatives. And of course, after Herzl's death in 1904, this becomes even more clear. And so all the efforts, I would say, between 1905 to 1917, until the Balfour Declaration, and I'm not underestimating how difficult it was for them, in a way, was to persuade the British government, as I said before, you don't only need a British Palestine, you need a Jewish Palestine. And it was not easy to convince everyone. There were a lot of Anglo-Jews who didn't like the idea. They were worried that they would be accused of dual loyalty. There were even some people who already knew enough about Palestine to understand that this is not an empty land, that there's an unjust side to this project, and all these more Arabophile, pro-Arab kind of personalities, like I mentioned already, Lawrence of Arabia. But they succeeded, and they succeeded by using methods, as I show in the book, that would be familiar for those readers who are familiar with AIPAC. Chasing politicians wherever they go, publishing in the printed press, having huge assemblies. They worked very hard to make sure that this is happening. And the fact that someone like the Rothschild family, again, I think didn't want to see all these poor Jews coming to Europe.
Right.
Invested a lot of money in the Suez Canal themselves, began to invest money in Palestine, and beginning to see some dividends for the economic investment in Palestine. They could be the ones who, by the way, as you mentioned before, would tell the British government, and we are Jews and they are Jews, so you can rely on us.
Yep.
So they had these magnates, these Jewish bankers and magnates also on their side. So economically and politically and religiously, they could put a very good case that it has to be in Palestine, even if strategically, not to mention morally, this was not a valid option.
Let's talk about the evolution of these lobbying tactics. I found the account of William Fulbright in your book to be fascinating, both for two reasons. One, we had just in this past electoral cycle in the United States, a similar dynamic with progressive members of the Squad, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush in particular, but there's been others who were just completely drowned out by AIPAC money. Although the dynamic, they were already sort of wounded in some way. And that is one of the things that you make the point about AIPAC, is that very often what they're doing is trying to exhibit and project power rather than actually using power to change things, right? I mean, it's almost like there's almost like a bigger shadow cast by their actions because they're strategic in that. But tell us the story of William Fulbright. I also find it fascinating because Fulbright was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee until 1974, when he resigns because he's lost his primary. Within a year, Joe Biden, a freshman senator, is on that committee, and he seems to have learned. I mean, this is completely speculation, and I don't know. I want to take your opinion whether this guy learns, like, oh boy, I just saw William Fulbright get taken out. And we should say that Fulbright goes on in April of 74, I think it was, on to Face the Nation and says the Senate is controlled by Israel.
That's right.
Tell us the story of William Fulbright, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, I will start from the end. That you're absolutely right. I think what Biden sees explains why in October 2023 he said, "I'm a Zionist president." I think there's a connection there between this and what happened. But let's start with Fulbright. Fulbright was very interested in the interference of foreign countries in American domestic politics. And he began to look who is registered as a foreign agent in the United States. Because if you are registered as a foreign agent, there are a lot of limitations about what you can do, and you're also under control. Your actions could be kind of monitored and supervised. To his great surprise, a lobby for Israel was not registered as a foreign agent. So he began to look more deeply into what AIPAC is doing. And the one thing that really caught his eyes, which is really the worst kind of violation of the American regulations and law, was that AIPAC was recruiting money in the United States to lobby for Israel, which was totally against the American law. And how did they do it? They were recruiting money allegedly for helping the poor people in Israel. So the money went supposedly to the impoverished parts of Israel, but some of it returned to AIPAC to fund its actions, and he exposed it. It wasn't difficult, by the way, to expose it. AIPAC was so self-confident that nothing was done that clandestinely. That also, by the way, surprised him, how in the open it was. And he wanted an open session of his committee. He wanted really the public to understand that this is a grave violation of American regulations and law and should be stopped. He was also convinced that it doesn't serve American interests to be so one-sidedly with Israel. He was sure it undermines American interests elsewhere in the Arab world. But the lobby was strong enough, first of all, to make sure that the meeting would not be open to the public. Secondly, that the report that he wrote would not be published. So he leaked it to the Newsweek, to the magazine Newsweek. And then he became enemy number one for the lobby. And the lobby started chasing him from 1964 until they succeeded 10 years later to really kill his political careers by funding with huge amount of money whoever stood against him for a renomination. They also succeeded in failing his nomination as a foreign secretary, as a secretary of state, which he really wanted. And I think you're absolutely right. When Biden comes to that, this is not a theory. When Biden comes to that committee, as I say in the book, a new stage begins in the power of AIPAC. Two things are happening. They suddenly realize that most of what they have done is already in place. Namely, that most young American politicians, by inertia, without even being pressured, would know exactly what to say and how to vote when it comes to Israel. That they really don't need to work that hard. That people got the message and is working by itself. And secondly, that when there was any deviation, which didn't even endanger Israel's interest, wasn't even in Israel's interest, they would use all the might and the force to show that they are the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill. It was really power for the sake of power and deterrence, and it was behaving like a mafia in that respect, where you sometimes have to show your strengths, not necessarily because the strength is needed to solve the problem, but because you may feel that people might need a reminder how powerful you are. And there are many occasions like this in the history of AIPAC and its functioning on Capitol Hill.
It sounds like Israel's military doctrine. Go on.
But it also describes to a T deploying tens of millions of dollars to take out Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, because there is no way that Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, as members of already an anemic squad, are going to change the foreign policy of the United States in regards to Israel. But they made for, and the interesting thing is that the question of Israel barely came up in these races, at least in the context of like these of their districts. Bowman lost as much because he voted against the IRA because he wanted more of Biden's actual bill. But the bottom line being, like, these are trophies that AIPAC can basically put on their wall, big enough so that people, and I think you even have a story about, they would keep the doors open in their offices as a way of when they were dressing people down, as a way of exhibiting, like, you don't want to be what we did to that person.
Absolutely. And there are more absurd examples. I mean, there is a kind of realization in AIPAC that they are not gaining enough support in civil society. Yes, Capitol Hill is under occupation, so to speak. There's no problem with that. But there are new trends in American civil society, anti-Israeli trends in their eyes, pro-Palestinian. So they use the same idea of massive force in order to kill in its bud any development that they think might create a pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli local movement. And I give few examples how very small initiatives in the American civil society, especially after the first Intifada, definitely after the second Intifada, and after the siege of Gaza began in 2007, it doesn't matter whichever period you take, they would use massive force in a small village, in a small town, in a small union, in a church, in a small campus, just to make sure that they are in control. Now, of course, the floodgates opened last year, and they don't know exactly how to deal with that. I mean, they think that they dealt with this with bringing all these university leaders to the Senate and using the police against the student movements on the campuses. But looking at it more objectively, as I do, outside from the United States, they remind me of this Dutch boy that tries to, well, he succeeded in the story of putting his finger in his dam and saved Holland, if you remember, because he put his finger in the hole in the dam. I don't think that they have enough fingers to the kind of holes that are now in that dam that is called immunity for Israel in the United States.
Sorry.
Yes, Emma, please go on.
Well, just to circle back to the metaphor that you used earlier on about cracks in Israel that you're observing. I read your piece in Sidecar in June, The Collapse of Zionism, and you mentioned this at the outset about how you feel that this could be the end or the beginning of the end of the Zionist project, but that it's going to be a very, very long, bloody, horrible time in that death. Do you still feel that way as you felt in June, given Israel's attempts to engage in a wider war and bombing multiple countries in the Middle East, and Biden seemingly not capitulating to any sense and giving the keys over to Netanyahu in ways that I don't know if we could have anticipated the intensity of his support, even knowing what we know about him, back when we last had a conversation in October.
Mm-hmm. I changed something in my analysis, given what I've seen in the last year. I'm still convinced we are witnessing the beginning of the end, and I still think it's a long and dangerous process of collapse and disintegration. However, I am convinced that there are potential processes, I call them mini revolutions, that can still occur that would do two things. One, will shorten the period, and or secondly, would make it less violent. And I'll give 2 or 3 examples. I think the redefinition of Judaism as religion, as a cultural identity, the kind of things we are beginning to hear from Jewish intellectuals in the United States that are manifested in the way young Jews are now behaving on the streets themselves and on the campuses. The changes in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole, kind of new thinking in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Arab world, about the colonial structure of the nation state that was imposed on them after the First World War, the international condemnation of Israel, all these and many others are connected to the way we understand politics, to my mind. I think there is an attempt, probably started in 2008, maybe before. There is an attempt by the civil society to rethink about the essence of politics, something the left used to do but failed in doing. To rethink the essence of politics and has to change the very way politics is being done, not just locally in Israel or locally in the United States. I think it's a global phenomenon. And it's very difficult, of course, because the political elites always have a lot of power to make sure that nobody topples them and nobody changes the name of the game. But there are very powerful forces all over the civil societies on a global level that are they have, if I put it in simple words, they believe that political elites today, with generalizing, but politicians today are far more concerned with their career than with the problems of the society. And that the agenda of the political elites in democracies and non-democracies has very little to do with the real concerns of the people themselves. And Palestine symbolizes this gap for so many people, namely the foreign policy of a given country towards Israel is one very important indication what's wrong with the essence of politics in a certain country, whether it's the policy towards global warming, towards poverty, towards injustice in society, towards military expenditures, towards foreign adventurism. It doesn't matter. When you look at this, you see that Palestine begins to be this symbol for what we would have liked those in power to do in the right moral way. And I'm saying this because I'm optimistic that maybe I don't see it happening in Israel, but I do think it can happen elsewhere. I know we have right-wing, the emergence of very strong right-wing parties in the West, and we have Donald Trump and other populist leaders also in South America. I'm not undermining the importance of these forces, but like every time in history, this also brings out eventually the other side, and we saw it in the French elections. So I do think that I when we talked last, I think I isolated a little bit the process in the future in Israel and Palestine from the regional and the global context. When I look at the regional developments and the global developments, I'm more optimistic. And I think they can have, I'm not predicting, I'm not a prophet, but they can have a positive impact. And they include really the change in the way we do politics. We understand politics. We understand morality in politics. Everything the neo-capitalist, neoliberal system has convinced us are irrelevant features of politics: morality, moral issues, justice. All these, we are being told by political scientists in universities, are ridiculous, naive ideas of young people. No, they are coming back to the core of politics, because the level of politician is so low. They're so mediocre nowadays in so many parts of the world. So I'm optimistic about that. I can see its impact on Palestine.
I mean, I think to that end, in the event that Harris wins in this country, there's going to be, I think, just a real reemergence and explosion of energy to push back on what has been the Biden policy. It remains to be seen if it will be continued by her, but I don't think there's going to be the room post-election that there is prior to election because of the dynamics of this country. And I think, like, at least in the context of the United States, the idea of liberal Zionism is becoming as anachronistic as it sounds, I think, to a lot of people. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.